My name is Thomas, and today, at 25 years old, I finally decided to share something that happened to me when I was just 8 in our apartment in Brooklyn, New York. It was an old building on Ocean Avenue, built in the 1940s with those characteristic fire escapes and weathered exposed bricks. We lived on the 5th floor, apartment 5C. I remember perfectly the floral wallpaper, peeling at the edges and the characteristic creaking of the wooden floor. My room was at the end of the hallway, with a window that overlooked a narrow alley between the buildings. It was in that room that everything began. The first time I saw them, I was playing with my toy cars near my bed. It was an autumn afternoon, and the orange sunlight cast strange shadows through the curtain. At first, I thought they were just normal shadows, but then I realized they moved independently, as if they had a life of their own. They were dark shapes, some tall and slender, others short and twisted. They always appeared at the same time, between 3 p.m. and 5 p.m., when the sunlight began to weaken. At first, they just watched, standing in the corners of the room or near my old wardrobe. I told my mom, but she attributed it all to my vivid imagination. Things started to get worse when I realized they weren't just watching. I began to wake up with scratches on my arms and legs. Small at first, but they became deeper over time. My mom became worried, thinking I was hurting myself in my sleep, and took me to several doctors. The worst episode happened one December night. Snow was falling outside, and I was wrapped in my blanket, trying to sleep. I felt something cold touch my ankle, like long, thin fingers. When I looked down, I saw one of the shadows holding my leg. I tried to scream, but my voice wouldn't come out. That night, the shadow began to pull me out of bed. I could feel its cold fingers tightening around my ankle. The scariest part was that, as it pulled me, I could see more details of its form. It wasn't just a shadow. There was something solid there, something that seemed to have been human once, but was now distorted. I finally managed to scream, and my mom came running into the room. When she turned on the light, the figure disappeared, but left purple marks around my ankle, as if they were darkened fingerprints. It was the first time my mom really saw physical evidence of what was happening to me. After that incident, things drastically worsened. The shadows began to appear in other rooms of the apartment. In the kitchen, they knocked dishes and cutlery off the counters. In the bathroom, the faucet would turn on by itself at night. My mom started to notice that the temperature in the apartment changed drastically in a matter of seconds. Cold spots would form out of nowhere, even with the heater turned up to the maximum. An elderly neighbor from 4B, Mrs. Peterson, who had lived in the building for over 40 years, told us that our apartment had a dark history. In the 1960s, an entire family had died there under mysterious circumstances. The case was never completely solved, but there were suspicions of carbon monoxide poisoning. The manifestations intensified day by day. I began to have terrible nightmares, where I saw people with deformed faces calling me, wanting me to come with them. I would wake up screaming, covered in cold sweat, and frequently find new scratches and marks on my body. My mom, desperate, began seeking help everywhere possible. We consulted priests, mediums, and even a parapsychology professor from Columbia University. Each had a different theory about what was happening, but no one could make the manifestations stop. Professor James Mackenzie from the parapsychology department arrived on a rainy January afternoon. He brought several strange devices: EMF meters, infrared cameras, and audio recorders. As soon as he entered the apartment, his devices started showing abnormal readings, particularly in my room. During his investigation, he discovered something disturbing. Using ground-penetrating radar, he identified a kind of empty chamber beneath the building, directly below my room. After researching the historical records of the municipality, we found out that the building had been constructed over the remains of an old 19th century psychiatric hospital. The professor explained that sometimes places with traumatic histories can create a kind of energy portal, allowing entities of different natures to move between dimensions. According to him, I was particularly sensitive to these energies as a child, acting like a sort of beacon for these entities. One of the most chilling discoveries was when he analyzed the audio recordings made during the night. Amid the static noise, you could clearly hear voices whispering my name and phrases like "come with us" and "you belong to us." The most disturbing part was that some of the voices seemed to belong to children. During his third visit, Professor Mackenzie attempted to perform an energy cleansing session in the apartment. He set up a circle of crystals in the center of the living room and began reciting some ancient prayers. That's when everything spiraled out of control. The lights began to flicker violently, objects flew around the rooms, and a cold wind appeared out of nowhere, even with all the windows closed. At the height of the chaos, I saw something I will never forget. The shadows began to materialize completely. They were no longer just dark shapes. We could see their disfigured faces, twisted limbs, and empty eyes. They moved towards us, leaving a trail of intense cold in their wake. Professor Mackenzie, upon seeing the entities materializing, began shouting orders for my mother to get coarse salt and holy water that he had brought. The entities seemed to be converging into a single point in the room, forming a kind of dark vortex. The air became so thick that it was hard to breathe. It was at that moment that something even more inexplicable happened. One of the entities, which appeared to be a woman in an old, torn and stained nurse's dress, approached me. Unlike the others, her eyes were not empty. They had a reddish, hypnotic glow. She extended her hand towards me, and I felt an irresistible force pulling me toward her. The professor acted quickly, throwing holy water between me and the entity. The liquid began to bubble as if it were boiling upon touching the ground. The nurse let out a piercing, deafening scream that made all the windows in the apartment shake. The other shadows began to writhe and merge into one another, creating a dark, shapeless mass. My mother, following the professor's instructions, began to spread coarse salt at all the entrances of the apartment, doors, windows, and even drains. Professor Mackenzie pulled out an old silver crucifix and started reciting something in Latin. The temperature in the room fluctuated violently. One moment it was freezing, the next suffocatingly hot. The walls began to vibrate, and a strong smell of sulfur filled the air. The professor later explained that this was a sign that the entities were resisting expulsion. He raised the volume of his prayers, and the crucifix in his hands began to emit a bright light. The dark mass of entities began to concentrate in the center of the room, spinning like a tornado in slow motion. Objects flew everywhere: books, cushions, frames from the walls. One of my toy cars narrowly missed the professor's head, almost hitting him. The decisive moment came when Professor Mackenzie, in an act of courage, or perhaps desperation, advanced toward the vortex of entities, holding the crucifix in front of him. The light emanating from the sacred object became even more intense, practically blinding. The entities began to emit horrible sounds, like a mix of screams and wails. The spectral nurse, who seemed to be the leader of that macabre group, made one last charge towards me. My mother, in a maternal impulse, stepped in between me and the entity, holding a rosary that had belonged to my grandmother. The moment she did this, something extraordinary happened. A golden light began to emanate from the rosary, merging with the light of the professor's crucifix. The vortex started to spin faster, but now in the opposite direction. It was as if it were being sucked somewhere. The entities tried to resist, clinging to the walls and furniture, leaving burn marks wherever they touched. The professor continued his prayers, now louder and with more conviction, as sweat dripped down his face. Suddenly, there was an explosion of light, followed by a deafening sound, as if the very air was being torn apart. When we finally managed to open our eyes, it was all over. The apartment was in complete disarray, with furniture overturned and objects scattered everywhere, but the entities had disappeared. Professor Mackenzie explained that we had been able to close the energy portal that existed there. He performed a few more protection rituals in the following days and installed specific crystals at strategic points in the apartment. Since that day, I never saw the shadows again or suffered any kind of attack. Today, years later, I still carry the physical and emotional scars of that experience. Occasionally, I have nightmares about those events, especially with the red-eyed nurse. We moved out of that apartment a few weeks later, and I learned that the building was demolished years later to make way for a new development. Professor Mackenzie kept in touch with us for a few years, using my case in his academic research, with our permission and maintaining our anonymity. He passed away in 2018, taking with him much of the knowledge he had about those supernatural events. But one thing he always told me: some doors, once opened, never fully close,